Welcome to Searching for Answers, the program where we dig into the sacred text with full respect and reverence, but also with full interest and curiosity, because the Bible just has so much to offer, not only for its historical background, but for its spiritual value in our lives. So here we go. We are launching a new series now in those three little epistles by John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, right near the end of your New Testament, between 2nd Peter and just before Jude and Revelation, right between Peter and Jude there, right near the end of your New Testament. So while you grab your Bible, we'll get ourselves introduced and get right into it. Our participants this evening are Dr. Bernard Taylor. Dr. Taylor is an expert in both Old and New Testament, most recently on the pastoral staff of the Loma Linda University Church, but also teaching regularly both in the School of Religion at Loma Linda University and the Divinity School at La Sierra University. Also joining us this evening is Dr. Leo Rancelin. Dr. Rancelin is a New Testament scholar at Loma Linda University. He's Associate Dean of the faculty in the School of Religion here at Loma Linda. My name is John Jones. I'm at La Sierra University, and we're going to take a little time to just fill in some background here, some kind of the circumstances out of which these letters are written, because it enriches our reading. It kind of sharpens our eyeglasses, doesn't it, when we do that? So where shall we start with the question of who wrote this and when and what's going on? Who would like to kick us off here? Everybody's being polite. Dr. Rancelin, you start us, and Dr. Taylor will get you in on the conversation as well here.
Sure.
Questions: who, where, when, and above all, why?
Excellent question. Much to say there. These three epistles have a fascinating background. I think 1st John is more of a theological treatise, a homily, responding to some specific social settings, whereas 2nd and 3rd John have epistolary features, and we could clearly demarcate those as letters.
Yeah, 1st John doesn't look that much like a letter as a kind of a reflection, as you say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think the Gospel of John was written 80s and 90s. These three epistles 5 to 10 years later, responding to a number of issues in the Johannine house churches, I think, in Asia Minor, in the city of Ephesus. And it may well be that there was a group of people within those house churches that took the Gospel of John in a direction that highlighted the high Christology of the Gospel of John. And so 1st John may be somewhat of a corrective to that, where he underscores some aspects about the person and work of Christ and what Christian conduct, ethical behavior ought to look like.
Yeah.
And so I think both Christology and Christian conduct get underscored in very strong ways in the first letter to John.
How does the language of 1st John compare with the language in the Gospel of John?
There is a more polemical edge to it.
Yeah.
And
That means, polemical means
there's a
fighting.
harsh tone.
Right.
One gains a sense that people say that there are this dissident group of people who've left the church.
Yeah.
They're typically called secessionists. And John appears to be deeply concerned with the impact that they are having upon the church and the potential influence. And so you could say John is an exhortation to faithfulness, damage control, to build the community along the lines of both, as I said previously, Christology and ethical behavior.
So it looks like the disagreements arise already during the 1st century of Christianity, don't they?
Exactly. And as we typically say, the categories of orthodoxy and heresy typically reside within the 2nd century as the church was beginning to ascertain the Orthodox faith. But if you look at the language here in 1st John, especially this language of confession and denial, it's not just assent to faith, but also a focus upon the content of faith. So we could almost begin to use those categories of orthodoxy and heresy even within these three letters, because it's important for John that we confess that Jesus is indeed the Son of God, the Messiah, and has come in the flesh.
Yeah, it's surprising that there are already tensions over these very issues, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Bernard, when we look at the language here, the Greek, how does it compare with the vocabulary, the syntax of the Gospel of John? Are there aspects that we should be aware of?
The language, you asked a two-part question, and that's important because often we look just at the vocabulary. And you can look at the vocabulary, the words that are used here compared to the Gospel of John, and find many that are used in common. So if that's the only thing you look at, then it's easy to say that it's John, or as Leo mentioned earlier, Johannine, as we talk about the adjective from John.
Yeah.
But the contrasting makes it a little bit different. For the moment, I'd like to open the lens just a little wider, because these three, we call them epistles. Those of you who were with us when we were studying the book of Hebrews, the one before this, which is also spoken of as an epistle, this lacks that sort of, the characteristics of what would normally be a letter. And it's a part of the New Testament that we refer to as the Catholic epistles. Now, this is a small c. There is the Roman Catholic Church, and that's a separate entity. But the word Catholic is a word that means general.
Yeah.
And these,
it's to everybody.
Yes. Well, and not directed to any particular place. Like Paul wrote to Rome and Corinth and Ephesus and so on. They stand apart from these, which are more general in character. And what genre of literature, what type of literature this fits in will be an interesting question as we proceed through it. When I went to read this, I had a very interesting, distinct impression. I felt that I'd walked in on a seminar, perhaps not a sermon, but on a seminar. And until I opened the door, I didn't know anything that was going on. And as soon as I opened the door, I had heard, "We declare to you what we have heard from the beginning." And that pretty much captures the experience of doing this. It might be helpful to mention what a letter would look like. But if you remember Paul's epistles, in the letters in those days, you began with who the letter was from. You didn't leave the mystery to the end. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, or something similar, too. And there's the recipients. And that is not found here in 1 John. And hence, it doesn't have the characteristic beginning, and it doesn't have the characteristic ending. And so we are left with the necessity to try and draw from this. And also, when you read the earliest Greek manuscripts, it says nothing about John.
Right.
And this, but the early church fathers were the ones who spoke about it in this way. Now, of course, they were a lot closer to us, to the events of the time than we are, but at the same time, they could be removed by significant periods of time, a century and a half, two, and a lot of things happen in that period of time. Whether they drew it, whether they knew that this was the case, I think if we were left to our own resources and had to decide what we would link 1 John with, for instance, with the vocabulary and the similarities to John, we would, I think, be attracted in that direction. Now,
in the direction of?
In the direction of either John or the school of John's thought that followed, who preserved his words and kept it relevant and interpreted as time went by in the light of it.
So in that sense, it is Johannine, right? It belongs to that circle somehow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Similarities, differences.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Which
Okay.
can be put another way, reading of John, but applying it in a new situation.
Aha. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
we're not in Kansas anymore. We're not in Galilee anymore. We're in Ephesus or Asia Minor or something like that. And life goes on, and you know the pot has been boiling in the meantime, and now one of the things that strikes us is how early on and how with what difficulty those who had seen Jesus and those who hadn't
Right.
had to wrestle with the question of, here is someone who walked among us. It felt like God was at work among us in this particular individual. So we look back on that with a certain awe, a certain wonder, maybe a certain heartache, a certain nostalgia, the times we spent with Jesus. We look back on all of that. There is a sense of divinity at work among us somehow. But how are we to capture that? How do we define it? That was hard. It's hard for us today. The church for 2,000 years has wrestled with the divinity and the humanity, and sometimes tended for the pendulum to swing in one direction and some in the other, you know. And here we've got clearly before us the very outlines of the question. Was he God? Was he man?
Right.
Was he strictly God? Was he only man? How do we hold this together? What do we make of this? And I think that's the reason why it kicks off with language that is so reminiscent of John 1:1.
Right.
You know, in the beginning was the Word and so forth. Here, we declare to you what there was from the beginning, the word of life and so forth. And yet, we still struggle today to understand how to integrate Jesus as divine, Jesus as human, and the way in which that impacts how we're to think about him, his life, his death, his resurrection, what he did for us. They were struggling. Sometimes we do still today, don't we?
And I think it's important to draw out what you didn't say.
Yeah.
In particular, and
Yeah.
that is when we think of a place to put this, these are issues that were important to John.
Yes.
Now, I, for one, believe that John wrote his gospel beginning with the introduction in verse 19.
Aha.
And then when he had finished it, he wanted to be as clear as he could. We sometimes use the word pellucid, which goes further. He wanted to be absolutely crystal clear what he was saying.
Yes.
So he penned the prologue. And one of the reasons for that is if he began there, the word logos,
Yeah.
the word word, would carry a significance, but in the rest of John's gospel,
We don't see
never
it.
find
No.
it with that
That's really
sense.
interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And so what I'm hearing here is that the background, the language takes us to John, but it doesn't take us to Paul.
Aha. Aha. Aha.
So
Yeah.
Paul was in Ephesus and wrote to the Ephesians, but these are not the sort of issues in general that Paul faced,
Yeah.
and that concerned him.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to hook in, Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 19, the key word there is not the word word, but the word testimony, right?
Yes.
This is the testimony given by John when the Jews sent and asked him, "Who are you?" To John the Baptist, yeah. And that interesting poetic prologue, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, that really stands alone. And in the rest of the Gospel of John, the word logos word doesn't crop back up again. Isn't that interesting?
It's used, but not in that sense.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So here we are. Now, 1 John chapter 1, verse 1, concerning the word of life, the logos, the word of life, we pick up on, and we're going to unpack that. We'll see what that word of life really is now in this letter. So, these two writings have some hooks between them, and yet, as you've said so well, Bernard, the issues are taking particular shape now. They have to do with the understanding of Jesus, who he was, what he did, and how we are to understand.
If I could just add to that, I think these 5 chapters, everything John writes is shaped by the crisis that is within the community.
Yeah.
Everything. And the prologue here in 1 John clearly alludes to the prologue of the Gospel of John. But after that, a day or two ago, I read through the farewell discourse in the Gospel of John, John 14 through 17. I would say almost everything from 1:5 to the end dips into the farewell discourse.
Yes.
Those themes, he is appropriating those, reapplying them, reshaping them to address the specific situation that he faces here. And if I could just add one other thing I've been intrigued by sketching the secessionists and their theology, Christology, and their behavior. It seems to me that what you have here is kind of an esoteric, spiritual, elitist group of fellow Christians who are enamored with the Spirit and believe that these mystical, spiritual, enlightened experiences give them access to God, where they have fellowship with Him and a knowledge of Him. And that experience negates the necessity of community, of social interaction with fellow believers, and what one does in community and with the body, if you will, isn't really that important. And I think John, there are slogans that they use. He appropriates those and he takes those to task to underscore.
If we say we have no sin, for example. There
to
are
underscore the importance of community and ethical Christian living, that we love one another.
All right, So
Why would they say that?
Well, we're going to have to get into that.
Right.
Well, no. What would attract the secessionists, as you call them, to thinking in that sort of way?
Well, to me, and here's where we don't want to get too speculative with what's in the text. To me, what they've done is they've argued that these mystical spiritual experiences in which they have a knowledge and fellowship with God negates the need of community, and so in that realm of experience, they've obtained, if you don't mind me saying, sinless perfection. And so the necessity for forgiveness of sins, the death of Jesus, we don't need that.
I'm asking culturally, not yet theologically. Was there any philosophy? I think you have perhaps proto-Gnosticism here, incipient Gnosticism, an expression of Docetism as well, which we probably should say something.
Hang in there with us, folks.
We should say something about that. Because, to me, this motif of that when God's seed resides within us, when we've been born of God, wow, that just so resonates with some Gnostic literature of the 2nd century.
It really does,
So we're used to thinking this way, and as we look at this, it doesn't seem that different. We really could accommodate with what we already know, and there you have this problem. It's not opposition, but it's wanting to meld ideas together so that you don't have to change so much, and the sort of thing that we have today.
Well, we have it today.
Right.
And I think we have it in some parts of the early church. We can almost speak of the early churches, really, because they're different from one another, aren't they? But we do see hints of this already in Paul with his struggles with that bunch in Corinth,
Yeah.
who were so superior to everyone, right? Yeah. And they could say, kind of, well, hey, we've had mystical experiences, we have miracles. We don't quite hear the claim to sinlessness, but almost that they can indulge themselves as they wish without any kind of guilt. And so apparently there's a stream of this through some of these congregations that it sounds like maybe Paul would recognize this language here in some ways in the first chapter of 1 John as well. So you're right, Bernard. The question is a cultural question because before Christianity, this pulse beat is already beginning to be heard throughout the Mediterranean world. It's a kind of a cheap and shallow form of Plato's thought, in a way, that dualism, you know, the body is evil, but the body is not morally evil, it's just material and therefore negligible. And so in Corinth, if I hang out with the bar girls down at the waterfront, that's the body.
Right.
But the spirit floats free, you know. And so we've got some work to do here, because there are elements, there are temptations sometimes to think the same way. 2,000 years later. That dualism haunts Christianity all the way through, down to 2018, doesn't it, in some ways? So here we go. Somebody start us off. Who would like to kick us off in the first paragraph? Bernard, you want to do that? Chapter 1, take us down at least through that opening little thing, what we call for the first 4 verses.
All right. So I open the door, and here we declare to you what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. This life was revealed, and we have seen it and testified to it, and declare to you the eternal life that was with the Father and was revealed to us. We declare to you what we have seen and heard, so that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. We are writing these things so that our joy may be complete.
Yes. Some manuscripts have your joy, our joy. There's a little difference in wording there, but the impact is roughly the same, isn't it? But down through what we call verse 3 is all one sentence, isn't it, in the original?
Exactly.
And the original language, Greek, didn't have parentheses.
Right.
But I heard in your tone, as you read verse 2, you read it as an aside. If they had had parentheses, what we call verse 2 should have been a parenthetically marked. He's just loading it up and we've seen it, we've testified, we declare. Yeah. Right.
My translation has the advantage of an M dash.
Yes, that's right. You
Which
could
is
put
the
that equivalent of
sets it apart.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Now, what strikes me here, what we have looked at and touched with our hands.
Yeah. That makes it physical.
Concerning the word of life. This life was revealed, and we have seen it and testified to it and declare to you the eternal life that was with the Father and was revealed to us. Second M dash. We declare to you what we have seen and heard. There is from the outset a tangibility.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A tangibility that this is touchable.
Yeah.
Not just seeing it, you see with your eyes, you touch with your hands, you can feel it. But it's not mere feeling. It's not just impression. Christianity has a reality, a tangible reality that can come within the normal human experience rather than just something of the mind.
Yeah.
And so that already addresses the fact that Jesus was real. He was human.
Yeah. 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 And that establishes the ground, almost literally the ground under our feet, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Leo, what do you think?
So I think what John is saying, okay, you secessionists who are so enamored with the divinity of Jesus Christ, who feel you have knowledge and fellowship with God, who depreciate the humanity of Jesus and perhaps suggest that, Christ came at the baptism of Jesus and prior to his death, left. This sharp distinction between the material and spiritual, between Christ and Jesus.
Yeah.
You need to know that Jesus is God incarnate. And there's a pronounced stress on the incarnation here, God in the flesh, from the very get-go. And so I think you have here in the prologue the stress of the centrality of the incarnation.
Yes. And so Jesus is not someone who walks around with his feet 18 inches off the ground,
Right.
but really someone who knew suffering, pain.
And not just that, it's also, if you want to have true fellowship with God, you've got to recognize the humanity of Christ, that he indeed is God incarnate, and the only true way to have fellowship with God is within, I think he's suggesting here, telegraphing what he's going to unpack further. You've got to be part of the community of believers and live out the Christian life within that community.
If I could just address one issue. Somebody may be listening who noticed that you first used the word divinity and then that you used the word deity. Now, I'm venturing, knowing you, that you intended no distinction, but there are some who would say that yes, Jesus was divine, but he wasn't deity. And that the point here that you are making is that this really was at the full level a deity manifestation in the person of Jesus.
I'd like to say God incarnate.
Yes.
Is what you've got here.
Yes.
That's the stress.
God in flesh.
Yep.
Yeah, so the godness of Jesus is there. Can we use that word in English? The godness of him, but also the humanness of him, right? And the church had plenty of squabbles yet to come in subsequent centuries over this, starting with the Council of Nicaea in 313. But here, the point is to integrate divine and human in Jesus, thus integrating us as his body, right? So that we don't sort of look down on one another or drift apart. Something about the unity of Christ's being, something about the unity of the Trinity even, by implication, has something to say about our unity as believers and disciples here in this physical world. This is not an escapist religion, is it?
That's right. It's concrete.
Yeah. Now this looks to us, if our sense of timing is about right, roughly late first century, already the clouds of persecution are beginning to gather. Escapism has about it the hunger to somehow escape from the physical tortures that Christians are beginning to suffer. They're being thrown into prison. This is a religion unlike other religions of the day, which didn't engage the world in a physical sense, but rose above them. This one has its greatness of spirit, but it is utterly, utterly aware of the human condition physically. We'll talk about that some more next time as we meet again on Searching for Answers.